Welcome to Post Whatever with Ken Nishikawa. A couple of friends of mine, avid listeners of this show, thank you very much, and you know who you are, told me that given Sir David Attenborough has just celebrated his 100th birthday, I really ought to talk about how I used to voice him in Japanese. So, that is what you're getting today. Well, a portion of it anyway. Apologies. As you can see, I'm not recording this in the usual studio. I'm at my mom's in Atami, which is a lovely seaside resort town, and it's a very beautiful guest room. But it's an old wooden Japanese house, so it's not soundproof at all. And there's a storm out there, so I do apologize for the noise. With that out of the way, as I've mentioned a few times on this show, I used to work for the BBC in London in the 90s. Back when BBC Television Centre was still in White City in West London. The building is, or rather was, a magnificent question mark shaped structure with the central circular block nicknamed the Donut by BBC staff, which you would have seen it in shows like Monty Python. The iconic design, legend has it, began as a literal question mark doodled on an envelope by architect Graham Dorburn, who then thought, well, that'll do. And the rest is history. My work in that donut entailed lots of pressure, crazy hours, but I was young and really enjoyed working there. Sadly, as some of you may know, the television centre has since been sold and converted mostly into luxury flats. Apparently, no building in London, including BBC Television Centre, is safe from being turned into something unaffordable. Anyhow, I worked in a department called Japan Desk inside the donut. Corridors were circular. I remember some studios being so cold in the winter. But our task was to localize BBC News and other signature programs such as Panorama, Tomorrow's World, The Money Programme, and, of course, the nature documentaries for Japanese audiences. What the Japanese staff, such as myself, would do is, first, we were given a copy of the news piece or the program on VHS. We would then translate and write the Japanese script, and then either, if we were lucky, overdub it in the recording studio, or simply read it live on air ourselves. Now, in Japan, translators and narrators or the voice actors are usually separate professions, naturally, which makes sense as each requires quite distinct skill sets. The BBC, however, had adopted what could only be described as a singer-songwriter policy. One reads what one translates. So, to a young and unexperienced lad like me, it was a steep learning curve. But without that experience, I don't think I'd be here doing what I'm doing now, so thank you, BBC. I'm not sure if you've ever noticed this, but the translation industry has a rather pronounced gender imbalance. There are a disproportionate number of female translators and strikingly few male ones. As is my custom or my curse, I undertook extensive research on this matter, and my observations proved to be well supported by figures and facts. Global language industry's demographic data consistently show that women comprise roughly 60 to 70% of professional translators and interpreters worldwide. That includes the English-Japanese language pair. In some ways, even more so. Now, the question is, why are the reason for this pronounced gender imbalance? I think it can be attributed to several factors. The pipeline into the translation profession tends to begin at university, not in my case, but in most cases, where foreign language and/or linguistic departments have skewed heavily female for decades. Women consistently make up upwards of 70% of enrollment in modern languages and literature. The academic demographic directly translates into the professional market. Yes, pun intended. Like my old BBC job, translation work isn't always a conventional 9-to-5 job. It offers a degree of flexibility that is highly compatible with balancing work and family responsibilities, caring for children, running a household, which, it pains me to admit, still falls disproportionately on women in most societies. When looking specifically at the English-Japanese dynamic, domestic socioeconomic factors in Japan amplify this trend. Historically, many Japanese women would leave full-time corporate employment, or what they call seishain, which is a peculiar concept or tradition, but that's a story for another time. After marriage or childbirth, due to long working hours and rigid corporate structures, translation provided these women a highly intellectual, skilled, and respectable avenue to maintain financial independence, or re-enter the workforce on a flexible schedule. Another thing, in Japan, returnees, or kikokushijo, well, that's another weird phenomenon, but again, a topic for another time. They're basically women who lived and studied abroad from a very young age, usually due to their parents' profession, and became functionally bilingual, sometimes more comfortable speaking English than Japanese, and therefore often considered by Japanese society at large as one of them as opposed to one of us. Back home, these young women often find that the Japanese traditional corporate ladder did not fully utilize or fully compensate their bilingual skills due to lingering gender biases or this, one of them sentiment. It's becoming much less so, though, it must be said. But I'd be lying if I told you that Japan has accomplished the gender parity just because we've got the first female PM. So, independent or agency-based translation work offer a direct meritocracy where linguistic execution matters more than corporate policies. And then there's another dimension. When you are translating a live meeting or speech, you're not merely a translator, you are a facilitator, a helper, a bridge, a human buffer between two parties who would otherwise be staring at each other in polite incomprehension. Translation and interpretation are usually framed as supportive or intermediary roles, rather than primary leadership roles. Again, social expectations have traditionally funneled women towards these highly cooperative, communication-centric professions. And I might add one thing, being at the receiving end of this many, many times, when the meeting descends into a heated argument. The client's frustration has a tendency to be redirected at the interpreter, while us interpreters are merely being functionaries. We are, if you will, the television set being kicked because your football team is losing. As the cliché goes, women can multitask. I believe that helps a great deal when you have to perform simultaneous translation. And I noticed that women literally dominate simultaneous translation slots. At the BBC, I remember, the best simultaneous translators were all women, no exceptions. I don't think I was a bad interpreter, but I was pretty hopeless at simultaneous translation and made a complete fool of myself on live TV several times. And that's the BBC live TV. And as you can imagine, they were quite traumatic experiences. But as Nietzsche says, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. I believe, though, the following parts are the most crucial reasons for female domination of the translation kingdom, or I should say, queendom. But there is a strong cultural association linking women with high emotional intelligence, active listening, and a sensitivity to linguistic nuances, all critical traits for high-fidelity translation. More importantly, and this is the argument I find most persuasive, women appear to be, on the whole, less threatened by an encounter with a radically different set of values or cultural norms. Maybe that's because they don't feel that they're the center of the universe as strongly as us men do. As I said in the last episode, the quickest way to master a language is to accept not only grammar and things, but also its culture, tradition, and values that don't seem to make any sense. Comparing these to your own language or culture will steepen your learning curve. And this feminine open-mindedness or flexibility or ability to adjust to a new environment are precisely why I believe women tend to pick up the language more quickly and naturally than men do in general. Having said all that, I should also acknowledge that there are exceptions. Literary translation, for example, has historically been dominated by male translators. Books, particularly canonical literature, are more often translated by men. But I don't really think that's because men are better at it. I think it's probably more to do with the sexism in the academia. Anyway, I have digressed massively. The BBC's Japan desk, now back to the BBC, was no exception to this pattern. At any given time, there were perhaps 10 to 15 women and only around 3 men, myself included. Well, not that I'm complaining, but one thing worth mentioning. All of the translators there were Japanese, for 2 pretty obvious reasons. First, we were only ever translating from English into Japanese, never the other way around. Second, as I said before, we had to actually read the Japanese text on live television, which meant sounding 100% native and there was no margin for error. Plus, the location being in the UK, there was the additional dimension of the John and Yoko phenomenon. As I have discussed on this show before, the majority of the female translators were married to Englishmen, whereas we 3 men, save for one colleague, but I think his wife was American, not British. Anyway, including myself, we were single. Well, I was young, so this didn't bother me particularly, but there was a practical consideration. If you were married to a British citizen, you had the right to work in the UK without a work permit, which meant the BBC, or rather the subsidiary agency that employed us, didn't need to go through the considerable administrative ordeal of sponsoring a visa. Married translators with permanent residency were, in consequence, preferred. So, cut the long story even longer. That was the reason behind the acute shortage of male Japanese voices at the BBC, and that is why I ended up voicing David Attenborough. I do apologise for how long it took to get to the actual nub of the matter in this episode. This is, I'm afraid, post-whatever. So, it was not because my voice bears any particular resemblance to Sir David's. It was because they had no one else. That's the entirety of the story. A man is in the right place at the right time with the right male shortage situation, and suddenly he finds himself narrating the Japanese voice of British national treasure. Beyond Sir David, I lent my voice to a number of other luminaries. A former Prime Minister, John Major. Yes, I joined the BBC before Tony Blair moved to number 10. Tony was, in fact, my neighbour living in Islington at the time. Not that I knew him personally, but, you know. And who else? Noel Gallagher from Oasis, and among many others whose names I can no longer recall, and who, consequently, have been spared the indignity of association with this podcast. To say I was the voice of David Attenborough in Japan in the 90s, therefore, would be a terminological inexactitude. Or, to put it in plain English, a blatant lie. By the way, I write this script, but before I record it, I always consult with an AI, usually Claude, to fact check. And Claude said that the phrase terminological inexactitude was coined by Harold Macmillan, who used it in 1956 parliamentary exchange, and it encouraged me to attribute it to him. I, however, have a shadow of doubt because, if you could be bothered, I first came across this phrase terminological inexactitude in a book about the etiquette of an English gentleman published in the interwar period. I just wanted to illustrate that one cannot always trust everything AI says. Back to David Attenborough. I don't usually mention that I used to do the voiceover for him to many people. Well, now it's public, but because whenever I do, they invariably say, "Oh, can you do David Attenborough in Japanese?" And the answer is, no, not really. I can't. I was chosen not because I sound anything like him, but because there was nobody else. The BBC was not conducting vocal auditions for the perfect Japanese Attenborough. They were, in all likelihood, making desperate phone calls on a Tuesday afternoon. And such is the glamour of the broadcasting life. On that note, this has been Post Whatever. If you found any of that remotely useful, which I highly doubt, or at least mildly diverting, which is a distant possibility, do consider liking and subscribing. I'm Ken Nishikawa. Until next time, remember, the future of humanity, and indeed all life on Earth, now depends on us.